Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for Reimagining Education, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. It's for scholars and practitioners across disciplines to consider how best to cultivate character in pre-professional and professional education. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame. Super brief note on logistics. Should we have any Zoom troubles, there are folks managing the situation behind the scenes. Please also submit your questions through the Q&A, and they will be passed to me at about the 40-minute mark when we'll open it up for conversations. And with that, I'm really delighted to introduce Taya Cohen on honesty and moral courage. Professor Cohen is at the Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business, where she is a professor of organizational behavior and business ethics. She holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences. Her research focuses on honesty, ethical behavior, moral character, negotiation, and conflict management. She has received numerous research grants to fund her work. Most recently, she is co-investigator of the $4.4 million grant from the John Templeton Foundation for her research on honesty in organizations. Dr. Cohen currently serves as the president of the International Association for Conflict Management, and she is on the editorial boards of the Negotiation Journal, Negotiation and Conflict Management Research, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, Self and Identity, and the European Journal of Personality. She teaches graduate courses and executive education seminars on negotiation and conflict management, ethical leadership, organizational behavior, and research methods in behavioral science. She has a BA in psychology and an MA and PhD in social psychology. We also share a favorite movie in common, The Sound of Music. So she is a super busy woman, and we're delighted to have her here. This is going to be fun. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Well, you did your research, found out my favorite movie. I guess I've said that in interviews before. Yes, it is a favorite since childhood. Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm hoping we can have a pretty wide-ranging conversation. You have so much exciting new research that I would love folks to hear a little bit about, but I would love to sort of back up and just ask two questions. What is honesty, and how did you get interested in honesty?
Thank you. So the question of what is honesty is a bigger question than I think even I had realized up until recently. And it's one that we've been trying to answer for the past few years. I don't know that I have a short, succinct definition yet, but what I will say is commonly we think of honesty as communicating what we believe to be true, either verbally, written statements, non-verbally. And over the past few years, I have been thinking, I'm doing research with the understanding that honesty is much broader than simply communicating what we believe to be true. It also involves elements of intellectual honesty, so evaluating information for accuracy, searching for information, updating your beliefs to incorporate new information. And perhaps most importantly, honesty is not just about the communicator, it's also about the receiver of that information. And so it's more than just the content of what you say, it's also how you say it and the delivery of that information, and whether you are fostering an understanding of the truth, or at least what you believe to be true, in the recipient. So it is a dyadic process, or even more parties, depending on who's privy to the communication. And so all of that is a long way of saying, I think it encompasses both belief speaking, right? Communicating content you believe to be true, fostering understanding through the delivery of that information, and also searching for accurate information and updating your beliefs.
Great. So where did this interest come from for you?
So I had been, prior to studying honesty, I had been studying what we can think of as moral behavior more generally, and moral character. And some of that work, in some of the work on moral character, we were linking moral character with more honest behaviors, looking at characteristics of individuals that might make them more prone to honesty versus lying, whether it's in negotiations or in some kind of decision-making task where you can lie to get more money. And so there's characteristics of the person, there's characteristics of the situation, such as, are you making a decision as part of a group versus another group, an us versus them situation versus one-on-one. But we were thinking, at that point, I was thinking much about ethical behavior more generally, or moral behavior. And through my work with Emma Levine, a professor at University of Chicago, she and her work, and when she was doing her dissertation, we started collaborating, and she was focused on honesty and the complexity of it. And through my collaborations with her, we embarked on research that was trying to understand what are the consequences of honesty in people's lives, and what are people's expectations about that. And so in 2018, we published a paper about how showing that people mispredict the consequences of having honest communication. And through that work and that collaboration, it really opened up a lot of different questions about what honesty is, how we can communicate honesty in a way that is beneficial for our relationships, so consequences of honesty. And around that same time, I was invited by members of faculty members at Wake Forest University, as they were also thinking about honesty as a virtue, as a character trait, and different questions around honesty. And they invited me to be a co-investigator with them on this big honesty project grant through the John Templeton Foundation, in which you had mentioned in the introduction. And so that was this big initiative called the Honesty Project that is trying to answer a lot of questions about honesty.
So can you go back and describe a little bit this 2018 study you published? Because I think this notion of mispredicting the kind of outcomes of honesty is a really important finding.
Yes, so that study, we had a few different studies in the package. The first one we ran, it was at University of Pennsylvania, where my colleague Emma Levine was at the time. And we had people in Philadelphia complete what we called a difficult conversation study. And they were randomly assigned to one of three different conditions, one of which they had to be honest in all of their conversations and communications for 3 days straight. And each night we would send them a survey about what this experience would be like. 2 weeks later, we followed up. And we compared that to conditions where people had to be kind in all their communication, or one where they had to be conscious of their communication, a control condition where they would reflect on it. And before they embarked on this experience, we had people anticipate what it would be like. And if you take a moment and think for yourself what it would be like to be honest, fully honest, in all your conversations for the next 3 days, most people think this will be pretty terrible, that it will be damaging to the relationships, unenjoyable, maybe there'll be some value in it, but overall, people do not choose to do this experience. And even us as researchers, we're not quite sure what this would be like. But we were really interested in how honesty would affect people's relationships. And we implemented all these precautions of making sure people really understood what they were getting into, and that it was optional to do the study. They could drop out at any time, these sorts of things. And to our surprise, and to the surprise of the people participating in this study, honesty was not so bad. In fact, people reported enjoying it, or even when it was difficult, found it was helpful for the relationship. It was not damaging in the ways that they thought. And it was surprising. And people took the opportunity to have conversations that they had been avoiding, things that had been weighing on them for a long time, thinking of ways in which they could communicate honestly, but in a way that was not damaging to the relationships. And so we did this initial study, and then we followed that up with several others where we had people come to a lab and have difficult conversations with a partner involving feedback, providing a piece of critical feedback to a friend or a roommate. And it was the same pattern in that people were surprised at how positively these experiences being honest were, and very differently than what they thought might be the case, both on the communicator side as well as on the receiver side. Both parties initially thought this would be difficult, and both parties to the communication were surprised, I think.
So quick question, did you describe or have a conversation with the folks who were part of this experiment in being honest about how to be honest effectively? Or did you just sort of say, be honest in whatever way you think.
Yeah, we didn't give much instructions. Share your honest opinions, feelings, reactions. We gave some general instructions, but no, and that does lead to this larger question that now I'm doing research on with some of my team here at Carnegie Mellon about how people can be honest, but in a way that promotes the other side's well-being, because it's not just about the content of what is being said, which we commonly think of as honesty, but very much in the delivery of that, so the person could be receptive to the information so that the recipient understands it. And so through my work now, we're looking at feedback situations and conversations in teams to think about and learn more about how we could provide instructions that we can optimize on both benevolence as well as honesty and do that effectively. Whereas the initial research, we sort of let participants decide how they wanted to communicate.
Great. So personal favor. So 8 years ago, my now 18-year-old daughter sent me a PowerPoint titled How to Be a Better Mother.
Okay.
And there were 12 slides. And one included her description of the compliment sandwich.
Okay.
About how I could be honest, but it needed to be sandwiched between two lovely thoughts always. And this is something, as I might offer my perspective, my honesty, my critique, that she always says, remember the sandwich. And I know you have sort of spoken about the challenges of this, and I would love to sort of get you on the record for my daughter Ivy's sake, if nothing else.
So your daughter's name is Abby, is that what you said?
Ivy.
Ivy.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ivy. I, in the spirit of honesty, will offer my opinion, honestly, which I'm not a fan of the feedback sandwich or the compliment sandwich in how you describe it. One, if you think of a sandwich, we think of some truthful information or important critical information sandwiched, kind of hidden in between some positive statements that may or may not be relevant. And so the feedback sandwich, as it's sometimes called, is you're placing critical information between two positive statements. And I think the problems are twofold. One, it can lead to confusion. So the message gets lost. So there's this barrier or obstacle to discerning the truth. Like, what is this information that they're trying to communicate? And because the other information at the beginning and the end is often distracting. And also the information might not be deemed as trustworthy or accurate because we're not quite unsure sort of what to make of the information. And so I think it's better to give clear, say, honest feedback or communicate information honestly, but at the same time, deliver that information in a way that the other side will be receptive to, that also signals concern for the relationship. And so what I like about the compliment sandwich, or the idea behind it, is not the sandwich part, but rather that it is considering the relationship, the broader relationship at the context. And so I think that can be important to emphasize if it's not in this sandwich form potentially. Mm-hmm. So saying statements like, I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations. I know you can reach them because I care about you. These kinds of statements that signal that you have concern, that you believe in the person, that you do have positive expectations. They are positive. They do emphasize that you are trying to promote the other side's well-being. I think you can also say them and be honest without burying the lead.
Yeah. Great. Is that hard for people to do? So given that that study or a subset of studies that were published in 2018, people have an anxiety around frank, honest conversation.
Yeah.
How then, right? Like, is it almost easier for folks not to have a preamble and set it up, or do people struggle with that, or is this something that we need to practice? Sort of thinking about this notion of benevolent honesty and how to have honesty be effective.
I think it is difficult. I think, as you said, we do have anxiety or some concern. And I also think it is a learnable skill. We can all learn to communicate better. I think we become better at this the more we do it and the more we learn how to do it. And so when we communicate, I think we sometimes assume there have to be these trade-offs between saying something that is true but potentially critical, like brutal honesty. We assume if it's honesty, it has to be brutal, or we assume that we sort of have to not be honest and offer false hope or encouragement. We have these trade-offs, and this big question that that I've been trying to investigate recently is, how can we have a more integrative approach where we are both benevolent and honest at the same time? And to your point, I think it is difficult because it's not always clear how we can do that. And even if we want to do that, it might take a while to put our thoughts together. I mean, giving feedback or providing information in a way that is honest requires some work, because we have to figure out, one, what is it that I'm trying to communicate? And then how can I communicate this in a way that both gets the message across, and then communicating, what I believe to be true, what I believe to be important, but also communicate that in a way that takes the recipient's perspective, and so they will understand it. And so sometimes it's easier, we get an email, we just want to respond quickly on our phone, and there's all kinds of miscommunications. It might be honest, but it might not foster understanding in the recipient. And so thinking about how you can take the other side's perspective, so it's not just honest from the communicator's perspective, but also fosters understanding from the recipient's perspective. That is challenging, but it is something we can learn to do better at, to the point where it can become easier.
So as you describe sort of this, really thinking about honest and benevolent honesty, honest communication in general, part of what you said was taking into account the recipient's perspective, their point of view. To what extent do you think honesty is part of a cluster of virtues? So title of today's conversation is about honesty and moral courage. I think of honesty also as connected to notions of empathy. Are those parts of the equation for you, and how do you put the pieces together?
Yes, I think honesty is part of, I've studied moral character, and I think being honest, communicating honestly is part of that. Sometimes there might be a trade-off between honesty and say other values or things in some situations, not always. I think sometimes we assume that those trade-offs are more prevalent than they may be. But yes, I think being honest with yourself and others is sort of part of what it might mean to have moral courage, part of moral character. And you mentioned empathy. And so when I have been thinking about honesty as more complex than simply communicating factual content or what I believe to be true, it's also about the delivery, and the delivery of that information, delivering it in a way that fosters understanding of the truth in others, that does involve empathy and perspective taking and consideration of the other side's needs, whether you think of it as emotional intelligence, empathy, perspective taking, many other virtues, some humility, right? Thinking that the other side may have a different perspective, or understanding that the information you're communicating, it may be true based on what you know now, but being open to being wrong. And when we think of intellectual humility, or what I think of as truth seeking, right, searching for accurate information, that certainly relates to humility, which is another virtue. And so by thinking about honesty as a complex set of behaviors, it starts to highlight the connections between these other virtues and these other behaviors, such as empathy or humility or others.
So one of the things I often think is, to what extent should you say something even if you know nothing is going to change, right? Or should you be honest for honesty's sake, even if, right, there's no change in behavior, no change of circumstance? That feels to me like critique toward no end a little bit, right? And where I'm struggling a little bit is between honesty as a truth-seeking engagement and critique in the context of a workplace or a family relationship or a friendship, and how to distinguish the two.
I think honesty is an important value and virtue, but I don't think it's the best strategy in all situations. And there's some work, my colleague Emma Levine has done some research trying to systematically understand the different situations where honesty is not the best strategy. And I think we can think of some of those kinds of situations. And it relates to your question and your point of, is the information you're providing actually promoting the well-being of the other side? Is it something that they would benefit from knowing, or not? And is the timing right? So telling some 5 minutes before a person's presentation that their slides are terrible and their outfit's terrible, that is not helpful. Maybe it is honest in that it is what you believe to be true, but it is not something that would be appropriate or virtuous to share, not at that time. And so I think there is a distinction between communicating truthfully and not lying and not being deceptive, but also delivering it in a way that does further the well-being of others, and thinking carefully about timing of when it's important to communicate. I would also say, based on our research on mispredictions about honesty, we assume incorrectly that honesty will not be as appreciated as it often is. And so I think sometimes it's a rationalization. Sometimes we really believe, oh, I shouldn't be honest because the other side will be upset. They won't like what I have to say. And we think very much about the short-term difficulties of the conversation, or maybe that someone might be upset, the short-term harm. And I think we neglect to consider the value of providing truthful information for the person's benefit, both in the short term and the long term, because it strengthens relationships when it is communicated respectfully, when it's communicated in a way that shows concern for the other side. And so sometimes it's easier not to share information, but and people don't often share feedback or information. And then I think we neglect the long-term damage that does, because it prevents the other side from learning, from growth, from information that they actually might want to have. But the communicator may rationalize, oh, it would be uncomfortable, they wouldn't like it. And that's where we're often wrong.
Yep. Great. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between cultivating honesty amongst individuals? And I really like how you're structuring this notion of honesty in terms of benevolent honesty. So, but how do you create benevolently honest cultures where that's the norm more writ large?
That's a great question of how do you go from changing behavior for yourself, individuals, to larger systems. And I think it's a difficult one. So thinking about how we can model the behavior we want is one, especially when you have people in leadership positions or people who are very visible. I think it's not just about saying we want to speak up culture. This is, I think, one of the buzzwords now in organizations. How do we promote a speak up culture, or people say things, but modeling that, because too often you might have people in organizations, especially leadership, saying they want people to be more honest, but that honesty is not met in a way that signals that there's a lot of receptivity. So I think thinking carefully about the sort of how do you set culture more generally in the organizations, showing that highlighting how honesty is helpful for learning and growth, and also modeling how to be honestly effectively, and promoting norms, potentially even training. I think there's opportunities there to, related to feedback, related to team debriefs is one area that I've been thinking a lot about, is how can, when teams reflect on their work on a project, how can you foster a culture where people communicate their beliefs, their thoughts, their reactions in a way that is honest, that also can promote the performance, improve the performance of the team. So I don't think there's a simple solution of, put it in the organizational mission statement, although that can't hurt, right? And so, but it has to come at many different angles to really foster that culture, from the leaders to the process and the procedures, and creating space for these conversations and showing that that honesty will be met with receptivity.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned sort of the trend around speak up culture. For me, that seems to be not the kind of relational honesty that you're talking about. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you see that?
I agree. It is a little different, but I do think it involves relationships, because for people to speak up or bring forward honest information, or even if their opinions, um, the reason people do not speak up, the reason there is silence often is because people do not think the information, either that the information they have is not valuable, or that whatever they have to say will not be received well. That can create silence, or it's a difficult issue that it's not my responsibility, it's not my place, and so I think those thoughts have relational elements to it, because if people thought it was easy or valued, and their opinions would be received well, then I think it wouldn't be so difficult to speak up. And the fact that organizations, from what I understand in some of the conversations I've had, they seem to be struggling with this, or really wanting to promote it. So they see opportunities in with having a culture where people do communicate more honestly. It seems to be valued and being talked about more so than maybe in other times in the past. But I do think the relational concerns are working against that. If people feel like their relationships would be damaged, relationship with the organization, with supervisors, with coworkers. So there certainly is a relational element in my view.
Yeah. I know it's not your area of research, but could you talk a little bit about how you teach honesty? Are there ways that you've seen folks you think are working in this space that are cultivating this in higher education?
So the past year, I've been introduced and started to learn more about Mary Gentile's work on giving voice to values. And this has had a big influence on my teaching and my thinking. And I know she was a speaker in this seminar series a few months ago. And so she has an incredible set of teaching materials in her book on giving voice to values. I'm sure many of the attendees today are familiar with her work. And I see it as very much aligned with my own. And I've been using some of her materials in particular to highlight this idea that we have assumptions that speaking up with our values, having difficult conversations, communicating honestly, that we think these will go much worse than it actually is, but that voicing your values, that speaking up, communicating honestly is a learnable skill. We can get better at it. We can reflect on our experiences when things have gone well or gone poorly, and the same in experiences from others, and learn from that about how we can be more honest in how we communicate. And so I've thought a lot about that recently in trying to teach my MBA students and in some executive education seminars, of thinking about what does it mean to communicate honestly and communicate about potentially difficult issues like your values or things that you see going wrong, and what are the barriers and obstacles to that. And so I think Professor Mary Gentile's work, and then recently Professor Richard Schell at Wharton wrote a great book called The Conscience Code, which has some similar ideas, and I've been getting ideas from there as well. And what I like about both of those books in particular in my own work is it highlights this idea that communicating honestly, voicing values, acting more responsibly, these are learnable, actionable skills that we can all get better at by understanding what are the barriers to this, and how we can do it better by learning from some examples of others.
So I read somewhere that you didn't expect to graduate and teach business school students. Is that correct? That was sort of something correct. You fell in love with. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of teaching you do and what it is that you love about that work?
Yeah, that I love that you asked that. So I studied psychology as an undergraduate at Penn State University, and then did my PhD in social psychology. I had never taken a business course, an economics course, knew nothing about business schools. At both Penn State and University of North Carolina, where I did my PhD, the business schools were on opposite sides of campus. So my mother is a child psychologist, school psychologist. So I grew up in the house reading books about psychology, not business as much. And it wasn't until I graduated with my PhD, and my first position was at Northwestern University in the management and organizations department. They have a dispute resolution research center. And I was hired as a postdoc there. at the Kellogg School of Management, and it opened up this whole world to me that I didn't know about in terms of business school. And my research, my dissertation work was on conflict and why groups are often more competitive and less cooperative than individuals. And so it's very much about conflict. And then I realized there was this home for me studying conflict and negotiation, and also issues related to morality and ethics, which I was also studying at the time, studying guilt and shame, and that people in business schools were studying this, and they were teaching about these issues in the context of negotiations, teamwork, leadership. And so once I was hired at the postdoc, I sat in on all these classes of MBA classes and executive education, and then when I applied to jobs, I applied to business schools, and I was hired here at Carnegie Mellon in the Tepper School of Business, and it's been a great fit for me because I can take the insights and the ideas that I think are really interesting from psychology, and through teaching and also research, sort of distill some of the important implications for people's lives. And we spend most of our lives working in organizations and with people. And I think in business schools and research in business, perhaps even more so than psychology, here we're forced to think about some of the implications of our work and how they can be actionable, both in terms of our teaching, as well as broader implications for, say, managers or employees in companies. And so I like that connection between research and practice.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the ways your work on honesty intersects with your work on negotiation?
So negotiation is an interesting context because there's all these opportunities to not be honest and potential reasons not to be honest, from everything about outright lies, saying you have some other offer that you don't. There's all these strategic reasons, at least in the short term, that might push people towards dishonesty. But at the same time, negotiations are very rarely one-off. Sometimes they are, and we often have broader reputational consequences. And when you think about issues related to creating value or understanding one another, it's critically important to honestly share information about your interests, your priorities, right? Not just what you want, but why things are important for you. And, I care about these set of issues more than these, and I have more flexibility here than there. These kinds of statements where you honestly communicate about your interest priorities are very helpful for negotiation. And people, they don't communicate in that way. We assume that any information we share makes us vulnerable, and that's not often the case. Yet at the same time, there is certain information you should certainly keep private.
Mm-hmm.
I think that doesn't necessarily involving lie, doesn't mean you have to lie about it, because that can lead to strategic problems. But saying, I'm not prepared to share that information, or I'm not willing to share that information. Let's talk about these other things instead. Thinking of different ways you can communicate what the kinds of issues that you want to talk about, rather than disclosing vulnerable information. Anyway, all that comes into play in negotiation, because it is a strategic interaction in a way that sometimes in our personal relationships, it's a little bit different, because we're not trying to protect ourselves in the same way that we might be in negotiation. So that tension is in negotiation, I think, is particularly interesting, because there's all this push away from honesty.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a former colleague at Duke, Wayne Norman, whose interest is in adversarial ethics, and so looks at sort of litigation, sports, these places that have strong ethical codes, but they're adversarial settings. Is your sense that most folks going into negotiation are thinking about the importance of honesty, or the integrity and the ethics of doing that kind of work, or does the kind of adversarial nature come at tension with the ethics or the virtues that you might bring to the table otherwise?
I think the adversarial nature or belief that negotiations have to be adversarial does contribute to less willingness to be honest. And I've been doing some research with lawyers later on about honesty among lawyers, surveying people about their beliefs and trying to, especially in the context of negotiation. And so within negotiations, and there's often a lot of gray area of what's appropriate to share versus not. There's clear guidelines about outright lies or false statements. But when you think of honesty broadly, as I have, about communicating what you believe to be true. Do you have the obligation to correct another side's misimpression? And if you have a very adversarial view, it might push you away from doing that. And I think within certain contexts, so law and lawyers, there's beliefs not just that negotiations are adversarial, but also that how you behave in this one setting doesn't have broader implications about who you are.
Mhm.
And we, along with my colleague Eric Helzer, in the Naval Postgraduate School, we've called this a concept game framing. And we've been doing some work with lawyers looking at game framing of negotiation, which is this view that negotiations are adversarial. So I want to win, but just being adversarial and wanting to win does not, in my view, necessarily promote dishonest behavior, right? Because you can still try and win and play hard, as you like with sports or in a law setting, but not necessarily, but play by the rules, right? Not necessarily behave dishonestly. But this toxic combination of competitiveness, adversarial, combined with what we've called an arbitrary, and a view of the rules are arbitrary and artificial, that how I behave here is not governed by the same kinds of moral standards that might apply to the rest of my life. That combination, I think, allows for a lot of dishonesty and pushes people away from honesty. And so we call that game framing.
Super, super interesting. So just so I understand it, so in the context of lawyers and adversarial contexts, that there's a sense that the kinds of competition drives them to behave in ways that may be less honest. There's a sense that the rules are arbitrary, but that doesn't make them not a good person. That they can still have honesty and integrity and moral courage elsewhere.
Yeah, right. And that, and when you have the law context, also they're also advocating on a client's behalf, and
Yep.
And sort of that element of doing good for others. And I think this can create tension, and it's not, and to the question, related back to our earlier conversation, it's not always clear how honest to be, right? And so where the line is and how much you should disclose versus not, because at the same time, you do have to advocate effectively. And so there's a lot of ambiguity. And what we found in our surveys is lawyers vary widely in what they think is appropriate to share versus not. And it depends potentially on many factors, and the type of practice, the type of setting, different characteristics. But at the same time, I think people vary in their beliefs about sort of how honest to be, and it's complex decision making around that.
Great. So lots of questions queuing up. So I'm going to toss out the first one if you don't mind.
Sure.
So this is from Howard Gardner. This is fascinating, but it's important to consider the broader context. Honesty works in a family or small groups, like project teams. But what about the broader society? Politicians and pundits lie without consequence and even with approbation. Can you help us to bridge this gap? Is that even possible? That's a big one.
I wish there was a magic bullet on that one. It's yeah, this is a challenge. I think it's become a particularly difficult challenge in our time. I see the internet is really interesting to think about in one sense. So the ideal of the internet, it promotes access to information, promotes access to the truth and people to honesty, but at the same time, it also, everyone has their own favorite source of information. And when we think of intellectual honesty in particular, about sort of searching for accurate information, updating your beliefs, being exposed to differences of opinions, to the extent of that, which that is valued, to the extent that it's even possible to do, because it's hard to evaluate information. I think this is contributing to some of our current climate where people aren't sure who to trust, and it's not even sure what is accurate information, and it's all sides of the political spectrum, and everyone has different ideas on what accurate information or honesty is. And then I also think we have become very forgiving or tolerant of politicians and others, that behave in ways that are not honest. That, so it's really unclear of how much do we value honesty as a virtue. And, in the absolute, I think most people would say honesty is a good thing, but how much do we value honesty versus our favored candidate, party, whatever it is, winning, or loyalty. And I think those are questions for us as a society that we're grappling with, and people have very different beliefs about how things should be. But certainly the part of the comment that really resonates is honesty is just one value, and people may differ in their beliefs of how important that value is related to others. Personally, for me, and I study it, I think a lot about honesty. I probably value it maybe more so than many other people, and highly prioritized on the list. But I think it's not clear that is the only virtue, and what happens when other aspects in society might push us away from that.
Mm-hmm. So just a quick follow-up there in terms of you've talked about how there's this misperception that being honest in your daily life creates conflict or tension, and that people realize that actually it's a very good thing. Do you think if we in a broader, more cultural, societal level, realize the extent to which honesty actually has a significant upside in our daily life, we might value it amongst other values more?
I love that idea. I hope so. I mean, right, that gives us hope. I think it's an open question. Let's fast forward 5-10 years and try and get that conversation out there. I think having that awareness and that realization, I think, can be powerful, because it changes how we think about it. And if we start with these conversations, and then we see that our honesty actually leads to positive outcomes in relationship, and then maybe we grow a movement.
Right.
And I think back to your earlier points, I don't think it's just communicating bluntly without consideration of the other side. And that's why thinking about honesty, not just from the communicator's perspective, but also how is the information understood. And this gets back to the other questions about misinformation. And even when when you think of COVID and information about, say, vaccines or scientific information, it's not just communicating facts, but communicating information in a way that people can understand. I think that's important, because we need to understand the audience and frame our message in a way that the audience can understand. It's not just about communicating truthfully from our own perspective.
Great. Next question. How do you think about research that shows sometimes providing factual information to people about your side of an issue that you believe to be true to someone who disagrees with you can strengthen their beliefs rather than help them see your side of the issue? Is that useful? It's not necessarily helping them to see the truth, which would be against their well-being, presumably.
Yeah, I think thinking about how the information is delivered. So you can imagine communicating in a way that, as the question highlights, is making the person sort of double down on their own beliefs and become either defensive or more opposed to the idea. There's also a version potentially where the information is communicated the information is delivered in such a way that the other side could be receptive to. And again, where there's people studying how this can be done, I think in the realm of vaccines right now has been an area of study that we're learning more about. What are people's hesitancies? And then I think also on the side of the communicator, that the intellectual honesty or humility about, sometimes we're communicating what we believe to be true, but we could be wrong. And the other side may have a valid, even more accurate understanding than we do, but we can't see that because of our own blind spots. And so in talking about honesty, it's often difficult to, what is the truth or the objective kind of facts? It's really hard, because sometimes we are communicating about our own opinions or the way we ourselves see the world. And we, from our perspective, it's sometimes hard to fully understand the other, that they are seeing the world in a very different way than we might be. And so that's where, this relationship between honesty and humility comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Just because we think it is true does not necessarily mean we're right. So we have to have that intellectual honesty as well for ourselves.
So I think of that, I think of a recent conversation with my brother-in-law, who's an anti-vaxxer. And certainly there was no evidence I was going to muster that would change his point of view. He had different evidence. He was operating from a completely different perspective. it wasn't that if I approached it with humility, that he wasn't going to listen and try to understand what I was saying in the same way I would understand him. But that was really about sort of data and evidence and perspective on that data and evidence. What about when honesty is about an opinion? And so it's not, right, it's not about studies, it's not about evidence, it's not mustering facts and research. It's, I think this would be better.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've been thinking about this in the domain of feedback, and because someone might give us feedback, that doesn't mean we have to accept it and do the things that they think. So say someone gives feedback, someone gives feedback about, I think you should present this way rather than this way, or you should revise your paper in such a way. I think the importance of feedback is not necessarily that you take that advice or feedback as much as it is about understanding what is being communicated and being open to the possibility that there may be an alternative path. And it may be you decide, oh, I think they're right. I think this would lead to improvement on whatever the feedback is about. But it may be, oh, well, they have a different perspective. So how can I be mindful and either change it in a different way that because other people may have the same kind of misunderstanding. And so how can I change what I'm doing in a way that the other side could understand better? Or maybe there's an alternative, a way that would address it. That's not what they are necessarily saying is their advice, but maybe there's some path forward. So I think you don't necessarily, if someone's communicating honestly with you, I think we have to be open to it and learn from it. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to accept it, because again, you could have a different perspective. They could be wrong. But if we close ourselves down in a way that we are not receptive to receiving that information, then we don't, provide ourselves an opportunity to learn from that or evaluate it. So I think part of this honesty is evaluating information for accuracy, or evaluating the opinion, and thinking carefully about it, as opposed to just shutting it down, which is sometimes our first response, right, when it's hard to hear.
Yep. Good. Next question. Are there studies that show that honesty within the workplace causes or contributes to honesty outside the workplace? For instance, if an organization promotes honest behavior in the workplace, does it impact employees' lives outside of work?
I love that idea for a study. I'm not aware of any systematic research that has looked at that specifically. And I can say we are in the midst of a big systematic review of honesty in organizations, where we searched all the management journals for work about honesty. And I didn't come across anything that sort of looked at that. So if anyone out there knows anything of that sort, I'd love to read it. But that said, I think there is reason to believe that how we behave in one area will carry over into other situations. That assumption is underlying my work on character, that people do have behavioral consistency across situations, right? Not 100%, because in different relationships or different contexts, it may bring out different sides of ourselves. We may act differently, but overall, just like a habit, you start behaving in a certain way at work or at home, and it might carry over. And say with honesty, if say it really was promoted at work, and then we see that by being honest, assuming it leads to positive outcomes, I would imagine that would carry over into someone's personal life and vice versa. And the opposite can also be true. If you work in a climate where honesty is not valued and people are on edge, and if you say something that is not met with receptivity, or that's shut down, or if there's a lot of passive aggressiveness or things along those lines, I think those can develop into really negative habits that then carry over outside of the work. So I think it's not a one-to-one, we have different sides of ourselves, but certainly we don't act completely differently at work than we do at home, that there is, for most of us, some similarities between how we act in different contexts.
Great. Here's an interesting one. Can you talk about the paradox between students who may be honest in communication with others, but at the same time, those who engage in and rationalize academic dishonesty?
I think as over the course of our lives, we start to see connections over different behaviors in our lives. Certainly when we're younger, in particular, I think we might behave dishonestly in one area, maybe not think that that will have broader implications about how we feel about ourselves. And this is related to my work on guilt and shame, where I found that people sometimes hold on to these things. And when we often might try, say in students in that example, to compartmentalize and come up with all kinds of rationalizations there. I think that is hard to do in the long term because it requires a lot of mental gymnastics. But this idea of what I mentioned earlier with game framing, if you think that how I behave in this context, cheating on the exam, doesn't say anything about who I am and my character, that, if the teacher didn't make the exam so hard, or would they let me have my computer, so therefore it's their fault, right? All these rationalizations. And, if this test wasn't worth so much of my grade, there's all kinds of rationalizations where people may come to believe that it might be acceptable to be dishonest in one domain and another. I see these broadly, this lens called game framing, in a way that it is more likely to occur when we think that the rules, the norms, the context of a certain situation, somehow our other moral values don't apply to that situation. How we behave there doesn't have implications for sort of how we see ourselves, how others see me. And so certainly I think that happens in that example where, students, there may be opportunities to cheat. It doesn't seem like a big deal. And so then thinking about in higher education, or in, any education system, how do we cultivate the mindset that that it is better to be honest and learn than to try and cheat, and that you have to live with the consequences of that. And how do we kind of promote this culture? And it's a challenge for sure.
I see authenticity as closely related to honesty. You might say if honesty is expressing what you take to be true, then authenticity is being who one truly is. Have you bumped into authenticity in your work on honesty? If so, how?
Yes, it's a great question. So I think of authenticity, often it's thought of as sort of being true to yourself. I think where there is an important distinction is honesty more so is about interpersonal communication. At least that's how I'm thinking of it. It's not just about the truth to yourself, but in more of this dyadic process. And so one of my colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon University, Professor Oliver Hall, has some interesting work on authenticity and lying and how that is perceived. And so he has a paper titled "The Lying Demagogue." And one thing that's interesting about that paper is he has shown through his research that sometimes people can lie, and we know that they are lying, say politicians, but yet we might see them as authentic, in a way that they're somehow being true to themselves. They're communicating a broader message to the world. And so, that work does highlight that there can be this distinction, whereas I can see someone who is being dishonest. I don't think they are honest, but I think they are authentic. They are truly being true to themselves to communicate some larger belief, larger than themselves. And that may not be honest in terms of how they are communicating towards others, but it might be sort of true to themselves in some way. Mm-hmm. But I do think, when we think of self-deception and honesty, these things are certainly related. But one distinction is authenticity is often more related to feeling like we're acting in accordance with our true self. Oh. But it doesn't usually, what I think the problem with authenticity, it doesn't usually have the receiver, the other people's perspectives, and that's where it can lead to this more, maybe, I'm just saying my opinions here, without complete disregard to anyone else. And that's would not be a benevolent honesty in some cases.
Great. One final question. The annual review process is often a challenging interaction in any workplace. Have you done or know of any research about honesty and how to be honest in the performance assessment process?
So this gets back to the compliment sandwich. He said, from the beginning of our conversation. And so what are the challenges? So one, what is the purpose of the annual review is one question. And then how can they be done more effectively? And so in one of the projects I'm working on, we're looking at what we call honest feedback, and it relates to these reviews, although not exclusive. And when we think of an annual review or feedback, it's, what are the goals? So I think the goals are to promote some kind of self-awareness in the recipient of the review, some kind of either behavioral reinforcement in terms of positive feedback or some improvement oriented feedback, so giving people information about where they stand, how they can improve. And so to be effective, it must both promote some kind of accurate understanding in the recipient, so they're understanding what's being communicated, but it also has to be done in a way that they're receptive to, so that they can use this information. And so when we think of annual reviews, there's going to be challenges. One, because sometimes people might want to avoid these difficult conversations, so they give whether it's a compliment sandwich or any other kind of unclear communication, where the manager is communicating what they think is so clear, and then the employee, someone in lower in status and power, is not understanding, but also not speaking up because they don't want to appear that they don't understand potentially. And so sometimes the annual reviews are not as effective as they certainly could be, because the timing, if they're only happening once a year, if they're not clearly linked to behavior. And so I see these sort of part of a concept of feedback more generally, and thinking about how can we make feedback more useful, and so that it will promote the goals of feedback, which is so both awareness as well as potentially change or reinforcement, and thinking about how we can communicate honestly to do that.
Great. So as we wrap up, what are you most excited about in your research right now? Sort of, what is it you're working on that you're just, super, super excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work that broadly are kind of trying to figure out what honesty is, and what are all these different complex behaviors that involved honest communication is the work I'm excited about. And then thinking about how how that applies to different contexts, including, with lawyers, for example, or in feedback settings. And so I think I've been doing this work on honesty now for a few years, but it's just, the more research that I do in this area, the more questions it opens up. And, one of the questions you asked earlier related to sort of how can we teach this to others? I think that's a big open question. So where I'm at now is I feel like I'm starting to gain some understanding on what honesty is in terms of all the different sides of it, from the communicator's perspective, from the recipient's perspective, from, your own self in terms of intellectual honesty. But where I think there's big open questions that I want to know more about is how can we communicate honestly more effectively and more benevolently. And so hopefully, fast forward a few years, I'll know more about that.
Great. And with that, I just want to thank you so much for spending the hour with us. This has been a lot of fun. I'm thinking of all kinds of ways, both at work and at home, I can take some of these tidbits and deploy them. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. It's been my
lots
pleasure.
and lots of fun.
Yes,
and for those of you who joined us today, please join us next month at noon on May 16th for a conversation with Zena Hitz on education and flourishing. So all the best with the great research.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.